So I wanted to talk a little bit about this year's E3, but I don't have the time or the inclination to put together an hour-long supercut like I did last year. So here I am, with a handful of bullet points and a promise to myself that I'll collect some footage worth watching once I'm done rambling, just so I can show you the stuff that I personally consider to be worth digging out of that festering corporate dung heap. Before E3 even got started, there were a couple of bonus conferences. Google came out fairly strong with announcements for the long-awaited sequel to Baldur's Gate 2, and trailers for Borderlands 3 and a new Diablo-like Darksiders title buried amongst the constant Stadia waffle. Bungie then decided they needed an entire conference to talk about Destiny 2. I'm actually pretty sure they spent more time talking about their new DLC than most people will spend actually playing the damn thing. EA shat out their usual slurry of sports games and shooters. What you're looking at right now is footage of their new Star Wars game, Fallen Order, I think it's called. I don't really give a shit, but I needed some footage to put here, and it beats watching photorealistic sweaty men kick a ball around. Speaking of football, Microsoft were handed an open goal due to Sony taking a year out to go backpacking around Europe or whatever they were doing. And as much as I still consider the Xbox One to be a pointless console thanks to the existence of PCs, they actually showed us some stuff that caught my eye. The footage of the new Ori game is absolutely gorgeous, as is the impressively stylish notebook RPG thing, The Legend of Wright. A game has to go a long way to impress me purely with its art style, but this one managed it. Bleeding Edge showed us very little beyond character designs. I'm assuming it's some sort of MOBA, which wouldn't usually be my thing, but I'm cautiously optimistic about anything that Ninja Theory ever puts out. Finally, Elden Ring. For the uninitiated, that's the new From Software project with world design by everyone's favourite tubby fantasy boy, George R.R. Martin. Again, we saw nothing but a creepy, classically obtuse cinematic trailer, so I'm withholding my judgment. Still sounds like quite a dream team, though. Bethesda had basically nothing to tell us about. Rather than work on the games people actually give a shit about, they'd rather show up to the biggest gaming event of the year with some shovelware mobile crap. This is the video for something called Ghostwire, which is the only thing that kept me from falling asleep during this shit show of a conference. Devolvered everywhere as usual. Just go watch it so you don't miss out on the next phase of their cinematic universe. Carrion looked interesting though, so here's some footage of that. Is that enough? Good. Ubisoft were also typically Ubisoft. They're making sequels to Ubisoft games. Honestly, this was only marginally more interesting to me than Bethesda or EA. Their open world sandbox formula got old like 10 years ago. The most interesting open world sandbox in this year's collection was probably Gods and Monsters, a blatant Breath of the Wild wannabe, which at least had an eye-catching art style. Kinda Funny Games' presentation was probably my favourite this year because I'm an indie-obsessed hipster. There was a shitload of cool stuff in their rapid-fire showcase, so I'd recommend giving it a look, honestly. My 5 favourites though were as follows. Superliminal, a quirky artsy puzzler which fucks with your ideas of perspective. Brave Earth, which is yet another one of those retro platformers that I love so much. Mare, which we saw practically nothing of, but to be honest it just looked really pretty. Forgone, which also showed us very little, but preyed on my soft spot for really smooth sprite animation. And Lost Ember, which showed a wolf turning into a bird and is probably really sad. Expect these games to be on my Game of the Year lists in the near future. Square impressed me by sniping at my nostalgia with some sort of high-caliber weaponry, also known as remasters for Final Fantasy VIII and Crystal Chronicles. They also finally showed us the meat of the FF7 remake, and as someone who has had no faith in that project since day one, I was actually fairly impressed. They seem to have built the lackluster combat of 15 into something worth playing, and Midgar just looks stunning in modern vision. Consider me cranked up from pessimistic to afraid of being optimistic. Rounding everything off was Nintendo. I was expecting a lot from these guys, and they did okay, I guess. I knew Panzer Dragoon was a curveball, and even though we all knew it was in development, actually getting to see something of the next big Zelda title was also really unexpected. Also, hype lingers for the new Pokemon game and the Link's Awakening remake. The new Smash characters were what we all expected, and honestly, it was a little disappointing to me as someone who has no real attachment to either Dragon Quest or Banjo-Kazooie. There honestly wasn't much that got me super excited here, but there's no denying that they did a better job than the likes of EA or Bethesda. And just like that, the presentations are over. The hype can die down and we can all go back to our daily lives and begin the arduous wait for these games to actually see the light of day, probably sometime in about 3 years. Now fuck off so I can go do my coursework that I should have been doing instead of watching 15 hours of video game trailers.